And without further ado, let me turn it over to our speaker for today, Jose Arrieta. So this series is for research work in progress. So it's really meant to approximate a typical seminar. So I think Jose is happy to take questions as we go along. Is that right?
Exactly.
And if you want to, at any point, ask us to park and pause, we're happy to do that. And the chat function is enabled, of course, to gather comments as you go along. Over to you.
Perfect. So just let me share for a second so you can see my slides. And yes, so basically, hello, everyone. My name is Jose Arrieta, and basically, I was a doctoral student at ETH Zurich, but from May on, I will be an assistant professor in strategy at the University of Amsterdam. As I'm in transition, you will still see the ETH slides I use while in the market, as indeed, I will be presenting my job market paper entitled More is Different on the Effect of Preference Diversity on Exploration. To explain the gist of the problem I study, let me introduce an old Indian parable, the parable of the blind man and the elephant, but with a twist. In this parable, 6 blind men are asked to identify a new animal by touch alone. Each touches a different part of the animal and believes that the other one are lying because what they find out is very different from what they actually think that they touch. Imagine now that the men were sent by their manager to gather this data on this new thing that appeared. The manager will gain information from each viewpoint, from each of the blind men, and ideally, if it has enough inference points and inference skills, it could imagine that it's an elephant, even though each of them had an inaccurate view. Now, the manager could also ask people with similar background and preferences, so people like that see the world in the same way, to go and see the elephant. And by touching the elephant and getting feedback from the environment of when they realize that they were wrong, eventually they will realize that it's actually an elephant that is seen. So even though they're touching one specific area, everyone will realize that they're watching an elephant. Now, the general problem that happens is that common sense tells us that if people have the same viewpoints, they will fail to inertia and fail to notice what changes come along. As here, when a rhinoceros comes along and the people intuitively see it as an elephant, or when Polaroid, they're of like basic, like the foundational papers in strategy, when Polaroid saw that printers were needed to sell digital cameras because they saw that basically if you're taking a picture, you always will need a photograph or like a physical example of this picture. This, in short, is why diversity of viewpoints are highly valuable in complexity theory and wisdom of the crowd. So like the fact that people see the world in different ways makes it that, makes it that when the environment changes, the different viewpoints see the change more accurately. Now, later on, I will be qualifying this statement and showing how indeed diversity can help organizations explore and adapt, but only under certain and very specific circumstances. This specificity brings a threat of diversity in organizations. And when a manager fails to implement all interdependencies correctly, so like creating a policy that accurately implements the diversity measures well, then people could see diversity itself as a culprit of the failed strategy and not the fact that the strategy was too naive or badly implemented. So to study this problem, I will use the paradigm of learning under uncertainty and specifically focus on the exploration-exploitation dilemma. The exploration-exploitation dilemma was first brought to Organization Science by Jim March in 1991. This dilemma focuses on the relationship between the exploration of new possibilities and the exploitation of old certainties. In his paper, March focused on the fragility of exploration and made a call for finding ways of keeping exploration alive in organizations. From a top-down view, the literature in ambidexterity grew around March's call, and in general terms have found that the separation of exploration from exploitation work was best for designing ambidextrous organizations. So like separating either the activities of exploration from the activities of exploitation in time, in space, or in like the context, so that people focus all of their effort in one thing at a time. Different ways of separation involve separated by context, organizational structure, and so on. However, one interesting thing that happens is that when we look at the individual level, similar results appear. So we have uncovered actually in the last years that the brains of managers have a specific areas for exploitation and specific areas for exploitation. And that this efficient switching is the specific aspect that makes people perform better in ambidexterity. Now, the paper that I'm going to be presenting today is a paper that works at the team level, because here is where I claim that gaps appear in our knowledge. This level has been the focus of intense research in the past years, and among many findings, we learn how commission and omission errors can be seen as foundations to exploration and exploitation. However, by and large, the foundational theoretical models in this area assume one of two things. Either decisions are made by one agent, or every agent in the organization shares their views of the world. So there will be multiple people, but all of them basically see the world in the same way. So these are the two ways that like most of our theoretical models, so like the computational models that we use for understanding organizations, see that people make decisions on linear and uncertainty. However, this assumption, as March claimed, is almost certainly wrong as a micro description of a business firm. And there is evidence from qualitative studies that show how diversity of points of view help organizations to adapt. In this paper, I step away from this assumption and employ the concept of preference diversity to operationalize the differences in point of view of the agents in an organization. In doing this, I will follow the lead of qualitative papers, such as Kaplan 2008, who found that organizations faced with uncertain environments employ political processes such as majority voting and coalition building to select their new strategy and create momentum. Now, I used the term preference diversity before. In this paper, it encompasses the common sense idea that people see the world in different ways. Literature in social choice and multi-attribute utility theories has operationalized these differences into the concept of preferences. Preferences in economics grounds the difference in the viewpoints between agents. In this paper, I build on this concept and operational preferences as the weight that different agents place on different attributes of an option. These weights can be low or high and fully define what the agent find most valuable. An option is defined by the two attributes. Here, like an option is defined by the two attributes, x1 and x2. And the attributes are general concepts. For example, literature in hybrid organizations has employed the trade-offs between social and profit goals when making investment decisions. Yet, they can be even more subjective, such as in the case of agreeing on a restaurant. One can think of the quality of an online review and the distance to the restaurant as appropriate attributes. Or, as in the example I use in this paper, the expected quality of a startup business model and its intellectual property for a group of venture capitalists looking to invest in new options. I showed that the exact formula I employ, yet it is easier to explain this visually. Sorry, I clicked twice. Yeah, give me a second. So basically what you see here is that each point that you will have is one option, and each option is defined by its position in this two-dimensional plate. So you will have that there's like a value of attribute 1 and a value of attribute 2. And eventually what we'll have is an environment defined by the number of options that are available, but each person individually doesn't know what values there are out there. They will need to make choices and get feedback from the environment. As they make the choices and make the feedback from the environment, eventually they will find out how much value each choice has. So imagine, for example, now that we have a person that has a preference sort of in the middle. It's a person that is ambivalent between how much it prefers attribute 1 or it prefers attribute 2. So this person, what will eventually prefer are options that have the highest sum possible of the two attributes. And if we ask these people to choose many, many times, what we find is that the options along the diagonal are the ones that are chosen more often. If we repeat it for many, many environments, what we have is something that looks like this. So eventually the options along the diagonal are the ones that are chosen the most. One interesting thing now is that given that we have this lever, this preference, we can change it to increase it, for example, and have an agent that prefers attribute 1 more. And this agent is going to choose options to the right much more often than the options that are high up. This enables us to create agents that each of them are going to want different things. And specifically, what this paper is going to study is what happens when you put people who want different things together. And specifically, the research question that I will going to study is how does preference diversity affect exploration and adaptation? Specifically, does preference diversity increase exploration rate or the adaptability of the organizations to change? To do this, I study the simplest case possible. So I study an agent-based model based on a flat majority voting organization. This is an organization which each of the agents basically has the same capabilities of voting for an option that they want, and also has no hierarchy between them. So all of them are basically in a democratic process. It's also an environment in which people have stable preferences. So if a person wanted much more, like if a person preferred attribute 1, their preferences are not going to change as time comes along. So they're never going to start liking attribute 2. This simplifies the process because it allows me to just assume that people are stubborn instead of like having them adapt to what the group wants. And finally, following prior literature in exploration and exploitation, I formalize the model as an n-arm bandit. So there are going to be 10 different options available, and the people are going to be choosing them. The reinforcement model, this operationalization basically leads me to a reinforcement learning process with majority voting. However, in my case, this model requires some extensions. First, I require an environment that provides multiple attribute feedback. This is exemplified here by the X1 and X2. These two attributes are given to each of the agents, so the red one, the yellow one, and the green one. And each agent evaluates this feedback, and according to its preferences, calculate the value it accrues from the option. Each agent then uses this evaluation to update its beliefs on the value of the option. And then each agent is tasked with proposing an option for investment in the next step. This proposal will be employed in the next step for selecting an option for investment by the organization. In this final step, an option is selected by employing a decision rules,